Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you are watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. I have the wonderful privilege each week of leading conversations with some of my favorite Bible scholars and Bible expositors, and this week is no exception. I'm pleased to have Dr. Michael Svigel return to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast to continue our discussion of the contents of his soon-to-be-released book entitled The Fathers on the Future, a Second Century Eschatology for the 21st Century Church. Dr. Svigel is the department chair and professor of theological studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. He earned his bachelor degree from Philadelphia Biblical University, his Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and his Doctor of Philosophy also from Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Svigel has written many journal articles and authored, co-authored, and edited many different books, including a series of books on exploring Christian theology, a book on urban legends of church history, a recently released book entitled Exploring Christian Scripture, which I had the privilege to contribute to it, and of course the book we're discussing today entitled The Fathers on the Future, published by Hendrickson Publishers. Please join with me and listen in on our previously recorded program. Well, in Chapter 5, you unpack the early teachings about the kingdom by the earliest church fathers. You discuss the writings of the Didache, or the
Didache, I say,
but not the Didache. Right?
Not Didache.
It's not
Italian. Yeah.
Please explain to our listeners what the Didache is and what it has to say about the future.
Yeah. So the Didache is it means teaching, and it's teaching of the 12 apostles to the Gentiles. It's like a manual for newly appointed leaders of newly established churches, probably written sometime between 50 and 70, somewhere around there, first century. And it mostly is teach new believers, we live this way, we don't do these things. Here's how to do baptism, here's how to do Lord's Supper, those kinds of things. But the last chapter, which actually kind of cuts off halfway through, we're missing the ending, but the last chapter deals with eschatology, end times expectations. Hold firm, persevere, because there are these things coming. So it includes an Antichrist figure, the lawless one, or the evil one. It includes judgments and such, deception, the things that we see in the 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Matthew 24. And then it has Christ coming on the clouds and all his saints with him and raising the dead. And then it says very clearly, but not of all the dead. So because we're missing the ending, we don't know exactly how he wrapped that up and how he described the kingdom, but we do know that there's a partial resurrection. He says, not of all the dead, but as it is written, the Lord will come and all his saints with him. So most sort of objective scholars are looking at that saying, it looks like it's more comfortably read as a premillennial eschatology, because in premillennialism, the righteous are raised, the saints are raised in the beginning, then you have the intermediate kingdom, and then the resurrection of the wicked in that reading of Revelation 20. So several have looked at that saying, it's hard to tell because we're missing the ending, but with what we have, it sure seems to be an assertion of a premillennial eschatology already in the first century.
Christ is going to return to establish the kingdom, not that the church is going to constitute the kingdom, or that the church is the kingdom.
Correct.
And Didache means?
Teaching, the teaching,
So an early catechism almost?
Yep, exactly. Yep.
So, very good. Well, tell us, what does the Epistle of Barnabas have to say about
the kingdom? Good. Epistle of Barnabas, just to be clear, it's like Hebrews. It doesn't have a name. Somebody said, Barnabas.
Yes.
So probably not written by the Barnabas from the New Testament. We don't know exactly who wrote it, but like the Epistle to the Hebrews, they knew who it was who wrote it. So the author's technically anonymous, but Barnabas has a chapter in there that does a little bit of, which makes me kind of uncomfortable and squirm a little. He does a lot of allegorical interpretation. But what's funny about Barnabas is he's almost we would say, an extreme allegorist, okay, with Old Testament prophecies and passages. And the kind of wisdom out there is that if you're a literalist, you'll become a premillennialist, and if you're an allegorist, you'll become an amillennialist. Well, Barnabas takes allegorical interpretation and uses it to demonstrate a premillennial eschatology, which is kind of unexpected.
Yes.
So
it's usually the other way around.
Right. It's right. So what he actually tries to argue is that the Sabbath days, the 6-day creation and the Sabbath week, actually is itself typological or prophetic of the 6,000 years of history, and then a 7,000th year period of Sabbath rest for creation. And he says that's going to begin when the Son of Man comes and destroys lawlessness and destroys the lawless one, he says, an Antichrist figure, and establishes the Sabbath rest of a 1,000-year kingdom, which was actually pretty not unheard of in Jewish circles at the time, the idea of the 6 days of creation being 6 days of creation, but also kind of a foreshadowing or type of the future 7,000th year period of Sabbath, which means, bottom line, Barnabas is also teaching a premillennial eschatology, late 1st or early 2nd century. The point is, very clearly, Christ comes back, then that 1,000-year kingdom on earth begins.
And Hebrews uses the word sabbatismos. I think that's the only time that word is used about Sabbath rest, and I take the rest in Hebrews to be speaking of a coming kingdom personally. But
and many did. That's one example of a Sabbath being associated prophetically, the ultimate fulfillment of that being eschatological.
That's very interesting. That day and age will be characterized by rest, right?
Yeah.
The fox will lie down with the lamb, and the serpents will play with children. And children will play with them. And
peace and rest from enemies, rest from your, sinful, constant labors and struggles and things. I think that's liberation, and rest is a good image.
Yes. Here in Texas, I always say to my students, children will be able to play with fire ants. They are the result of the curse of the fall, because anybody that's experienced fire ants and stepped on a pile quickly, they swarm over your feet.
I'm hoping they're going to be burned up in the day of the Lord, personally. But
I just yesterday had to go through my backyard and cover 3 fire ants.
It's the season for that,
so that my kids don't stumble upon them. Next, we want to talk about Papias, or how do you
I
pronounce
say Papias, but that sounds Italian too. Papias, Tedacci. Yeah, Papias of Hierapolis. He was a disciple of John, too, a hearer of John directly. And unfortunately, we only have snippets of what he wrote and descriptions of what he wrote. He basically went around and talked to the surviving eyewitnesses of Jesus in the late 1st century. So you had John, as well as a couple others that lived into the 80s and 90s, and had them comment, tell stories and explain scriptures and explain what Jesus said and taught. And then he also drew from those who were disciples of those apostles, like Polycarp, he himself, and many, many others. All his colleagues at the time would have been disciples of apostles, and recorded what they said the apostles were teaching. So he had 5 books of comments on the sayings of the Lord. We have 0 of them around today. I'm still hoping Dan Wallace will find them somewhere in some library on a bottom shelf or top shelf. But we do have snippets of it, and he is described very clearly as saying he believed that when Christ returns, he's going to resurrect the righteous, have a 1,000-year reign from Jerusalem, and after that will be the final judgment. So clearly he was also premillennial and claimed to have gotten this from the apostles themselves.
Now, just before we move on to Justin Martyr, these are not canonical.
Right.
They're not apostolic in origin. So we don't include them in the canon of Scripture, the books of the Bible. Would you elaborate a little bit more? A couple
of them were for short period of time in some places by some people referred to as Scripture. Barnabas, for instance, and Didache they debated or discussed it, mostly because they came from the 1st century, most likely. And they were early enough to have been possibly written by an apostle or associated with an apostle. But the majority did not accept them. They accepted them, though, just because they're not apostolic or inspired doesn't mean they're not good Christian writings, and even true in a lot of things they assert. Just like a book you or I might write may not be perfect in everything we say, but we're they're good, valuable, edifying Christian writings. I like to say that the Spirit gave not just apostles and prophets, which is our New Testament writings. He also gave evangelists, pastors, and teachers for building up the church. And even though those people aren't prophetic and what they write is inspired and inerrant, they're still beneficial for edifying the church. So I think some of these early fathers, we look at them, we see what they say when they're all in harmony. We have to explain that. And I think the best way to explain it is they are in harmony and unity on certain topics because they're getting those directly from their own teachers.
Very good. So what about Justin Martyr as it relates to the kingdom?
So Justin Martyr is going to be the first one we mentioned who doesn't have a direct connection with one of the apostles. He's next generation. And we have several writings by him, his apologies, which are written primarily to unbelieving Gentiles. And then he has what's called Dialogue with Trypho, which is kind of a debate between him and Jewish unbelievers. And he's trying to demonstrate that Jesus is their long-awaited Messiah, as prophesied in the Old Testament. In that book especially, and there's a couple places in his apologies, but in his Dialogue with Trypho, he very clearly holds to a future Antichrist who's going to come, reign for 3.5 years, times and half a time. He takes that as a reference to the time of the Antichrist, and then also believes that and says the all right-minded Christians on all points believe that there will be a resurrection of the righteous, 1,000-year reign in Jerusalem, which will be rebuilt and adorned and enlarged and beautified, consistent with the Old Testament prophets, he says. And so he has a very literal understanding of these restoration passages and 1,000-year kingdom, just as we would hold today.
Very good. Sounds very persuasive to me.
Yeah, that's right.
Back to Irenaeus. What we've alluded to his teachings, but would you share a little bit more?
So Irenaeus, same thing. He has a future period, the 70th week of Daniel. He says the Antichrist will, set himself up in the temple in Jerusalem and declare to be God. He pulls together Revelation 13, 2 Thessalonians 2, Matthew 24, Daniel 7, Daniel 9. A lot of these passages that you pick up any book in our circles related to the tribulation, we're pulling all these together as well. So he has a future 7-year tribulation, the middle of which something's going to happen there in Jerusalem, the abomination of desolation, and then that's going to launch the 42-month or 3.5-year reign of terror of the Antichrist. And then that's going to culminate with the return of Christ to set up his kingdom, judgment of the wicked, judgment of the beast and false prophet, binding of Satan, and then that 1,000-year kingdom. So his chart looks the same as mine.
It does.
If he made charts, it would look very similar to mine.
Daniel 9:27, that Antichrist will set himself, and we look at Matthew 24:15. Jesus
Bring
says
that together.
which Daniel said, and then Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2. He'll set himself above all other so-called gods and demand to be worshipped. So that's...
Which is interesting because he says very clearly that he's going to set himself up in the temple in Jerusalem. And as most of us know, in AD 180, when he was writing this, the temple has been destroyed for 110 years, which doesn't bother him at all. It's going to be rebuilt by the Antichrist or the time of during the tribulation. So he's taking those things very literally, even though he knows, current events are not quite fitting that.
Very interesting. And of course, anybody that's been to Israel or has seen a picture of the Temple Mount knows that a shrine is there on the top, currently, a Muslim shrine. And it's going to take a person empowered by Satan to be able to destroy that, have that, persuade groups of people to remove that and build a temple. What's interesting is some archaeologists and some people say, well, maybe you can build, you don't have to destroy it, you can build it right next to it. And I said, well, that's still not going to be either way. It's not going to be an easy feat. That's for sure.
In just a moment, we'll return to our previously recorded program, but now our missions moment of the week. Let me introduce you to Francis. Francis is a Ugandan who is a graduate of the National Theological College and Graduate School.
My name is Francis Onyinge. For 23 years, I thought I knew Christ. I thought I knew him. But then the moment I was introduced to the NTCGS program and one module after another, I realized I was actually very green. The amount of wisdom that the professors began uploading onto me has really been transformational in a number of ways. One of them is in my family. We used to have these sessions where we would go and sit together and begin praying. The thing is, we would just, talk about the Bible in ways we didn't understand. When I joined NTCGS, I realized that the way we were handling the Bible wasn't the right way. We were really off the mark. My family is growing. We are understanding the Bible better and better. And my kids are very interested. Right now, I'm teaching at Global Leadership School. I was given the Bible curriculum because of this training that I am getting from National Theological College. To cut the long story short, I have learned a lot of things. Has really been transformational.
The National Theological College and Graduate School has 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. If you'd like to learn how you can partner with NTCGS in training nationals like Francis to do the work of the ministry in Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and East Africa, please visit ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Now back to our previously recorded program. Well, in this same chapter on the earliest church fathers and the coming kingdom, you include a quote by Philip Schaff, who is a very well-respected church historian. He makes a very significant statement regarding the author of the Didache, as well as other early church fathers, authors. He states, now I'm quoting, "The greater probability is that he," the author of the Didache, was a Chiliast, which means 1,000 years.
Yeah, we say millennialist, but Chiliast, same thing.
He was a Chiliast, like Barnabas, Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and the majority of the Ante-Nicene fathers. Please explain what a Chiliast is and why this statement's significant.
So millenarian means 1,000 years, milli, 1,000. Chiliast is from Greek, which means 1,000 years. So one is the Latin version, one is the Greek version. In most authors, they use them interchangeably. A Chiliast is someone who believes in a future 1,000-year kingdom. A millenarian is someone who believes in a future 1,000-year kingdom. I do want to caution viewers to say, look, sometimes authors distinguish these two. A Chiliast is someone who holds to an earthly kingdom, where a millenarian might just speak in terms of a heavenly kingdom or whatever, anyone who believes in a millennium. Generally speaking, though, they're used interchangeably. So he's basically saying there, or admitting what most, I like to say, non-vested scholars, non-vested patristic scholars who don't have a dog in the fight, can just read the text and say, listen, this is what they say. Admit that the 1st, 2nd century fathers, when they're not silent on the issue, because they don't all talk about it, they're premillennial. And you don't really see clear beginnings of amillennialism until explicitly, not until Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century, and implicitly Clement of Alexandria around the year 200 or so. So it's the Johnny-come-lately in eschatological perspectives.
If truth is on our side, and we believe it is, we'll find that in the Scriptures. But we must be willing to go wherever the Scripture leads us, right? We have to care more about truth than it is than defending our system or our beliefs.
Right.
And that's one of the problems we have, right? A lot of times we can't see our own biases, or we have such an affinity for a system of beliefs or a particular theologian or denomination. Let's just be honest. It's sometimes you don't bite the hand that feeds you. You get paid by an institution that has a certain eschatological or theological conviction, and your job is to defend that. And I like to say, look, I teach at Dallas Seminary because of my eschatology. I don't have my eschatology because I teach at Dallas Seminary. And if I had change of conviction, I would, just do the right thing and resign. There are other jobs, and I think that's integrity. So, but, throughout history, it hasn't always been that easy. So you're part of a denomination or tradition, and your livelihood depends on it, and your job is to interpret Scripture and such in a certain way. Yeah, I agree completely. I am here because I strongly hold to these views, and should be willing to resign if I change my views.
Yep.
Philip Schaff, he seems to be an
19th century Swiss, German, primarily church historian, patristic scholar. is not a premillennialist, or was not. Well, maybe he is now. Bad joke, but yeah, I mean, he died. He lived basically the whole 19th century and did a lot of work. He did some very early work when the Didache was rediscovered on the Didache, and he just said, "Look, let's just admit it.
Yeah.
This was the dominant view in the early church, and we just have to deal with it."
Which is very
Noble,
it's refreshing.
right? Yeah,
yes.
it is very, yeah.
Well, what were the contributing factors in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries that you would argue led to turning away from what seems to be the early understanding of the church fathers?
Yeah, I suggest several things in the book. A couple of them I want to mention. There was a philosophical changing going on, so you had very Jewish ways of looking at things and understanding things, and then Platonism and dualism, separating the physical from the spiritual and the heavenly and the earthly. And then once you've separated those, you kind of exalt the spiritual above the physical or the heavenly above the earthly. And so if you have a way of reading the kingdom passages in a more spiritual, heavenly sense, you're going to favor those because of that philosophical background. Intellectual, you do see later critics of premillennialism in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, calling the premillennialists sort of simple, naive. It's almost kind of sad the way they describe them. You know, they describe Papias as someone of very little intelligence, and because I guess taking looking at the text and say, well, it says there's going to be the city of Jerusalem rebuilt, so that's going to be fulfilled with a rebuilt city of Jerusalem. Very simple and naive, and right, but rather than this. Spiritualizing things. So they're kind of castigated as too simple. Sometimes castigated as too Jewish. Well, I want to be very careful to say it doesn't mean that they're anti-Semitic per se, but those other influences I just mentioned, especially taking something literal, is just philosophically not really highly regarded. And that was also with the Jews. How the Jews understood kingdom passages as being fulfilled literally in this world. And so deeper you go in church history as anti-Judaism, and then especially later as anti-Semitism kicks in, it becomes pretty simple to win an argument. If you just associate something with being too Jewish, you've won. It shouldn't be that way. I want to be very clear to the viewers that being an amillennialist and taking things more spiritually doesn't make you anti-Semitic.
Right.
Doesn't make you anti-Jewish.
But if you're
from the other direction, if you're already anti-Semitic,
dispensationalist.
exactly. So it does work in the other direction. So calling something too Jewish. Also, the political climate changes. As you know, in the 4th century, Christianity is made a legal religion by Constantine, and then by 380, it's the official state religion. And the old narrative that we just described was, these wicked kingdoms are attacking us and killing us and martyring, and we're being martyred, and you just wait, Jesus is going to come back. He's going to destroy the wicked pagan empire and establish his kingdom, and we're going to be reigning with him. And that story doesn't make as much sense now that the kingdom is Christendom, right? Jesus is coming back, and he's going to wipe out the Christian
Constantine and his
empire?
church. Yeah.
What? Wait, he's going to destroy it doesn't make sense anymore. So there's a need for a different way of putting this together. Well, maybe this is the church, or the church is the kingdom. Maybe we're experiencing a manifestation of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, and the kingdom is now. So that starts to take the place.
So I also mentioned this a lot in my classes. We tend to interpret the scripture based upon our experiences, what we
expect
in the world,
to see, right? Yeah.
And that seems to be why Augustine's approach to the church being the kingdom, spiritual kingdom, would have been so popular. Right?
Yeah.
Constantine's the emperor, but he's also now a Christian.
Yeah. We're no longer being persecuted like this anymore. Maybe that sort of tribulation, it's given way to kingdom now, right? So there's a rereading of some of these end times, the apocalyptic judgment texts that fits more.
And so Augustine was hugely influential, right?
Yeah, he wasn't the first amillennialist, but so I think Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria in the 2nd to 3rd century were, more amillennial. Then you had 3rd century where the approach was to try to kind of remove the book of Revelation from the canon, so we don't have this millennium passage. That failed because 2nd century, it's one of the best attested books in the 2nd century. John wrote it at the time of Domitian. It taught a millennium. I mean, they're quoting from it all the time. But then by the 4th century, 5th century, Revelation comes back in, but I like to say it was kind of sent into theological rehab, and it comes back with this new way of reading Revelation 20 as a present spiritual kingdom rather than a future earthly kingdom. And having kind of dealt with that and spiritualized things as far as its interpretation, now it's kind of welcomed back into the canon. Augustine provides this new interpretation of Revelation 20 that says the first resurrection, rather than being future and literal resurrection of the righteous, it's a spiritual resurrection of when we're born again. So it's the church. It's what we call the new birth, regeneration. And that means Christ is currently in heaven reigning, and we who die and depart and go with him are reigning with him. And we, in a sense, in this world, as Christians, as part of the spiritual kingdom, are reigning with him. And that will come to an end when Christ returns and raises all the second resurrection bodily. And so it's taking that future expectation and shifting it to the present. Now the millennium begins at Christ's ascension and ends at his return.
And it was the Council of Ephesus, wasn't it, that made this dogma, and to believe in a literal millennium?
No, not really.
Was
not actually.
superstition?
No, yeah, no. Actually, they did. So at the Council of Ephesus, there are some fathers who talk about the millennium being superstitious, but there's no. This is one thing that's very clear. There's no official condemnation of premillennialism per se.
Okay.
There were still church fathers, church leaders who believed in it. Even there were the hangers on that wouldn't let it go. But you do hear some comments by some of the people at the Council of Ephesus in 431. Where you can see how unfavorable premillennialism was. They're making fun of it, basically. But I want to make clear that there's no official condemnation of premillennialism.
Okay. But as we think of Augustine, anybody that's looked at Origen and Augustine know that their approach to interpretation was a lot of allegory. They had three senses for Origen and four senses for Augustine. And I think Zuck is the one that says something to the effect that it led to authoritarian church and the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if you can't read the scriptures as there's going to be Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt and it's going to be glorious and, the Gentiles are going to come to it. And if that's not what that means, then someone has to tell you what it means.
Right.
And who is that? It can't be anybody, it has to be, right? So that if the text isn't meaning what it seems to mean, if the new covenant, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, right? Well, if that doesn't mean Israel and Judah, and it means something else, then we need someone to tell us what it means. So it does kind of lend itself to this need for an official interpretation
by the church
if the text doesn't mean what it actually says. So, that does ultimately lead in those directions.
And one of the great things the Reformation movement was getting the Bible back into the language of the common person and emphasis upon the perspicuity of Scripture, that we can study it and work hard at coming to an interpretation.
Let Scripture interpret Scripture. We can all agree that there are still going to be details that we're just going to have to say, is this an objective genitive or a subjective genitive? I don't know, But on big picture issues, especially the big picture issues of eschatology, I think it's pretty clear.
So we do like a consistently literal, understanding figures of speech, understanding metaphors, but recognizing that promises made, covenants made, we expect those to be fulfilled just as prophecies have been fulfilled already.
Correct.
Were fulfilled in a literal way.
Yep.
Well, our time is up for today's episode, but again, we are not finished discussing Dr. Svigel's excellent book, The Fathers on the Future, a 2nd century eschatology for the 21st century church. So be sure to listen to our next episode of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, where we will continue to discuss Dr. Svigel's excellent book. It is an incredible resource that you will want to acquire for yourself. It's set to be released in just a matter of days from the recording of this episode. So make sure you go and order your own or even pre-order your copy of The Fathers on the Future, a 2nd century eschatology for the 21st century church. It's published by Hendrickson Publishers and can be purchased wherever you purchase your books online. Also, if you're enjoying the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, would you consider leaving us a 5-star review, share it with a friend, and subscribe to this YouTube channel? These actions will help our podcast become more accessible to those who are searching for faith-affirming programming. Thank you for your consideration. Well, until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.